So hi, I'm Derick. I'm European, living in London. We can talk about why I call myself European in a moment. I work for the PHP Foundation partly. I also work on Xdebug and I work on PHP date time support. I am also GrUSP, without a G. I maintain a PHP.NET infrastructure. I like maps, beer, and whiskey. It's irrelevant to the talk, but I thought I'd throw it out there. And if you want to have questions, you can find me on Mastodon or here on the conference. That's all about me. So I'm going to show quite a lot of code, quite a lot of old code and some new code that will not compile quite just yet in your versions of PHP. One of the bigger things in PHP 8.4 is the continuation of making typing better, making it easier for you to add bits of language to your applications to not have to do lots of annoying stuff. Now, before PHP 8.4, if you want to do any kind of public reads and private sets, you had to mark your property as private and you create a public getter, right? That's a very common pattern that you see a lot, but it means you have to have getters and sometimes also setters to do these things. Now in PHP 8.4 you don't have to do that anymore. You can now type these things immediately without having to create a getter or setter, which is kind of handy. There's a few concerns here. The first keyword is for getting, the second one is for setting, but you also need to use the set in between. There's no get in between the parentheses, because this is a very common setting. You have a public get and a private or protected set. There's also a shortcut for that, so that you don't have to use a public keyword. So this implies that it is public get. You can create any combination, but the strictness of the set needs to be the same or higher than the getter. That sort of makes sense if you think of it. So you can't have a private get and a public set. It won't allow that. Again, also not very useful. So this asymmetric visibility this actually comes back in a few other things. There's a few things around this. So it only works with type properties. So you can't have all the checks that PHP does for properties with access and things like that, read-only and stuff like that, they are always only work on type properties, because the untyped properties, they are shortcutted in some other way. As I said, the set visibility must be equal or less than the main get visibility. If you use weird array kind of things, then that follows set visibility, even though you might be sort of reading this, kind of weird. The same thing if you inherit properties, they need to have the same type, and it is allowed to widen who can read and write to it. So you can, just like you have a private property in an inherited class, you can make it a protected property. You can also do it with asymmetric visibility. If you use private set, it also makes your property final. There is some strange interactions happening with private properties in classes anyway, because if you have an inherited class that redefines your private property with the same name, they're actually created as two private properties. They're sort of namespace. It's not something you see unless you like var dump an object or something like that, or you serialize it, because you get some weird things with null characters in there. You might have seen that at some point. But this gets too complicated with the asymmetric visibility, so PHP will now not allow you to have in an inherited class a property with the same name as in the class that you're inheriting. Read-only has been redefined from private set, sort of, to protected set, but still has this write-runs responsibility. So if you use read-only, by default it will mean a protected set, which makes sort of sense, unless you mark it as private set yourself. Normally read-only properties you can write to in any context that you can write to as a public property, but that now changes as well with this change. Now, PHP 8.5, not out yet. This has been merged into the code base, but it will survive. I think it's pretty likely, but you never know. Is that before 8.5 you couldn't have the public and private set on constants. It just left out for some reason. Now, I should say class constants here. Now, exactly why you would want to do that, I don't know, but sometimes we add things in newer versions that we've forgotten about. All right. One of the other bigger things in PHP 8.4 is property hooks. So that sort of builds on top of asynchronous visibility, but in a slightly different way. It basically allows you, instead of having to define a setter and getter method, to implement that logic directly when you define a property. So you get the code together. So basically what the syntax says here is that if I'm reading the full name property, it will return the value of this first, concatenated with a space, concatenated with the last name. Don't ever store names like this, because names are way more complicated than first names and last names. But this is an example that was in the RFC. Same thing if you write to the full name property, if you attach a new value to it, then it first will get the value. This is a variable that is automatically introduced into the property hook. I haven't defined it here anywhere myself, and you also can't do that. It will explode it or split it by space and then write it to the first and last property. And then we set is modified as true, because why not? So there's an interesting interaction in here, because first and last are actual properties. They are defined on the class. We have done that with in a constructor here, defined as properties. But a full name property isn't an actual property. If you would debug this, an object with this class in Xdebug, the full name property wouldn't show up, because there's no storage attached to it. It's only a virtual property in a way that you can read and write to it, but there's nothing stored with this property. The moment you use a property name in either the getter or the setter, it will have to become an actual property with actual storage. So that's how PHP does that. Now, I find this a little bit of a contrived example, but I actually found some use case in code that I've written a long time ago where these property hooks are actually quite useful. So let's go back in time before we had no typing in PHP whatsoever. So this is code that is written in 2003, or 2004 maybe, long time ago, where we already wanted to have some type enforcement of type and value enforcement on properties that we're setting. And the way how you could then do that is by having the underscore set and also underscore get magic methods that would get triggered anytime you try to write to a property that doesn't exist. And the implementation that we then did so long ago is we had a specific property called properties that would then store these actual properties as an array element. And because this is protected or in some kinds private, you couldn't directly read and write to this. So the way how we would do typing for a property setting, in this case UID referencing, it's something email related, we would check when you write to this in the underscore get method whether the value is a Boolean. And if it's not a Boolean, we throw a value exception. PHP, of course, has its own value exceptions now. And if it works, we just set it as a value. Now, of course, when we got type properties in PHP, you can rewrite this to something like this, right? You can just set the type directly on a property. But there were a few other cases as well. Like for the list limit property, we wanted to make sure it's an integer, which we can do with this type definition, but we also wanted to make sure it is larger than 0 or larger, I should say. And that is something you couldn't do in PHP yet, because you could only enforce the type. So with PHP 8.4, you can now rewrite this. So we check for whether it's a number and whether the value is larger than 0. You can do that now in your set property. So set gets called with the value, and if the value is smaller than 0, then we can throw these value errors yourself. And then, of course, the moment you throw an exception, things will stop. The type itself, we don't have to check with isInt anymore. Of course, you can type that directly on a property. So set and get property hooks are actually kind of useful. They also cause the bug on Xdebug, because Xdebug checks where you have lines of code that you can run, and it was only familiar with functions or methods or files. But this is now an additional type of function or an additional location where you can have code. Xdebug didn't know about it, so if you would set a breakpoint in these things, it would sometimes refuse to set a breakpoint because it didn't know there was actual code in there. That's now fixed with the release that I made yesterday. So you should not be able to have to run into that now. All right, next one. How often have you written code like this, where you create a new object, and then you have to have the double parentheses because you couldn't call a method on this directly? PHP 8.4, you don't have to do that anymore. Yay. However, you do have to specify the parentheses after your class name. Normally, if you do a new class, you don't have to use a parenthesis, but if you want to use this syntax, then you do have to do that. Otherwise, there's an ambiguity in the PHP language. Now, this works not only for direct methods, it also works for all of the other things that you can do. Again, I copied this from the RFC just to show you that it works everywhere. There are some weird things in PHP sometimes, like this line. Does anybody write code like that? Oh. Yeah, there's always one. Please don't do stuff like that. Unless it's generated code, I suppose. Right. Now, this is a PHP 8.5 kind of thing. So earlier, we could already have constant expressions. They were introduced in PHP 8.4, where you could have an expression in this case, in a default value, right? So I have string input and then array callbacks. It has a default value that has the closures in it. But this wasn't allowed yet in PHP 8.5. This is something that's going to be newly allowed in PHP 8.5. But there's some restrictions to this, like these functions. So if it's a method, it has to be a static method. If it's a function, they can also not rely on anything from outside the scope because they have to be static, pretty much. That also means that the values cannot rely on either using things like use, because that would have to copy something in from the scope where you're running it, or can you use short closures, because that automatically takes the outside scope into what you're calling. So you can only do that with things like str to lower. I mean, this is an example here where I basically have a string like hello world, and then I do a few steps to first lowercase it, then replace all the non-letters with a dash, remove the dashes on the outside, and then replace all the double dashes with a single dash. Those are the 4 steps that I'm doing here, right? This code isn't particularly very readable, would you agree? Yeah. However, PHP 8.5, we might get the pipe operator, which would allow you to do things like this, which is a lot shorter. I mean, it's not, the example isn't quite 100% the same, but it's a lot shorter. When I just checked this, it's currently in voting. It was 26.4 and 5 against, or something like that. So there's a good chance that we'll make that into the language. Again, there's a few restrictions here. The way how this works is like the value on the left-hand side gets put as the first argument into the function on the right, or the code on the right, the expression on the right-hand side. So str to lower, how many arguments does it accept? Accepts 1 argument. Things like preg replace accepts multiple arguments, and because it accepts multiple arguments, you cannot do that directly because it wouldn't know where to place the variable or the input. So in these cases, you'd have to wrap it in a short closure that I'm doing here, just to be able to make sure that the X that the short closure gets put into the right location in the call itself. This also works for static methods or any other closure that you have. It isn't, you don't have to spell it out like I'm doing here. I think this is kind of useful. I think it's a good new addition, and I'm pretty sure it will make it into the language as we go. I added this slide when I was listening to Roman's presentation. Right. But there's a few other things in here as well, like I put them the wrong way around. That's why I got confused. So in this case here, I'm using a static functions and stuff like that. But here I'm also allowing the ... operator, which turns this into a closure directly. That is something that you couldn't do in PHP 8.4 either, but that is something that is new for 8.5 as well. And of course, with restrictions that they must be freestanding functions or static methods. PHP 8.4 introduced parsing HTML, HTML5 to be precise. Have you ever used the DOM extension in PHP to parse HTML? Pretty sure. It's actually fairly problematic because how many websites are still using HTML4? It's mostly HTML5 now, right? And PHP's parser didn't have an HTML5 parser. And if you write conforming HTML4 or 5, then this is usually not a problem, but the way how HTML4 and HTML5 resolve inconsistencies in what you've written, how does it handle when you don't have a closing tag, these are different. The rules for handling these are different, which can cause some issues if you want to parse HTML to make sure that it's conforming, then you might get the wrong answer, and that could introduce security issues in some form, I suppose, as well. Now, so we looked at 8.4 to see whether we can replace the parser that is part of the DOM extension of libxml, the library underneath, to see whether we can make that HTML5. But the library that PHP uses doesn't support that. So no, we can't do that. Also, we were thinking, switching the parser from HTML4 to HTML5 without letting you know is also not a great idea, as an understatement. So the plan came out of that we find a new library that can parse HTML, and then create a wrapper around that you have to opt into. So we created a new namespace, the DOM namespace, and we put in there the abstract class document, which is basically what the original DOM document class was. And then there is a XML document in the namespace and an HTML document in that namespace. That's the HTML specific one then will use an HTML5 parser, whereas if you would use the normal DOM or DOM HTML document, I actually don't even remember what it's called now, would still use the old HTML4 parser. Which means if by changing a line in your code, by going from DOM document to DOM/document, or actually DOM/HTML document, that's the only thing you need to change to upgrade from an HTML4 parser to an HTML5 parser. To be consistent, in the same namespace, we also created the XML document class. And originally that didn't do anything, except for basically going to the class that already existed. But we found out that actually the XML parser in PHP also wasn't quite conforming to standards. It was missing the way how it handles properties, and there was some function calls missing. And some behavior was missing. But there's also something we could now fix, because by creating this extra class in this namespace, it means that we can fix all these things in there, and then you as a user can opt in into using this fixed behavior. So that also makes it possible to introduce new functionality without breaking existing functionality, which is something that we always try to do. Not always succeed, but always try to do. Right, PHP 8.0 had a just-in-time compiler. It makes everything very slightly faster. I would call the one in 8.0 a experiment, and I'm not quite sure how successful the experiment was. The way what it does, what a JIT engine or a JIT compiler does, it takes your PHP code that gets changed into an abstract syntax tree. We call them AST because that's a lot easier to pronounce. This AST that can convert it into an internal structure. We call it bytecode or opcode. And the JIT engine, if it sees that specific functions or parts of code has been used a lot, will compile that directly to something that runs directly on your CPU. And of course, that runs a lot faster, or so you hope. Turns out PHP is actually a really quick language to begin with. And because this JIT compiler can only do that for bits of code that are just PHP code, the moment you call a PHP function or an internal function or a function that you've written yourself, it needs to come out of this JIT mode. And then when you run PHP code again, it needs to come back in again. So that overhead always, well, not always, but mostly negated any time where the JIT engine could provide you with some useful performance boost. The only real place where it actually helped a lot is if you had a bit of code that did algorithms that didn't really call any other functions, which is not something that happens a lot. So the JIT engine gave a little bit of a speed boost, but you probably wouldn't really notice it, to be honest. Now, there's also an issue that it was specifically written for Intel CPUs, and now most of the new Macs are ARM machines, and you see that more in cloud environments as well. And in order to add support for that, they basically had to rewrite the whole thing again, which is not great, because anytime you want to support a new CPU type, you'd have to redo all the work. So in PHP 8.4, Dimitri worked on a new JIT engine based on a different framework that he also wrote. intermediate representation, which is basically an AST for converting the bytecode to CPU code. And by implementing a different backend for this code, it was much easier to target different CPUs later on. A lot easier to do. Now, this replaces the JIT in PHP 8.0. You're not going to notice it because it works exactly the same, although you might get slightly different bugs. Bugs happen. It's also a bit faster, but it also has at least the opportunity to get rid of or improve on some of the issues that the original 8.0 JIT engine had, where it is easier to add optimizations for calling functions and stuff like that. Now that work has never happened, so the performance boost of the new JIT engine, as we call it, wasn't much more either, but it was at least a lot easier to maintain for us. We also changed how you enable it. Instead of setting the memory usage from 0 to a number, you now need to, the default for opcache.jit is disable instead of enable with no memory. It was a bit odd. It's still part of the opcache extension, so if you're using this, you upgrade from PHP 8.3 to PHP 4, you don't really have to do anything. It will just work out of the box. Now, as Roman indicated in the talk, because the JIT engine, not very many people know how it works, and it doesn't really provide a lot of performance. We're actually not sure whether it's worth keeping, because it does introduce a whole different code part in the engine that also needs maintaining, and can have its own bugs sometimes. All right. Back to some lighter things. We now get the deprecated attribute, which is an attribute you can set on functions, on methods, on class constants, or everything. And when you use that, PHP will warn you when this function gets called or the code gets loaded that this function or whatever other element is deprecated. The attribute takes two arguments. They are both sort of free-form. The first one is basically your error message or your warning message. And the second one, the since argument, is basically a way of you describing since when this deprecation happens. But the value that I've used here, the 2.4, is free-form text, so you can do whatever you want. So in this case, when you then run the test3 function, you get this error message. As I said, you can also do this on other things. You can do this on class constants, you can do it on methods, and a bunch of other elements as well. I think this is kind of a neat way than having to use a doc block with deprecated in it, that then your static analysis axon, this is now supported in the engine, which is kind of nice, I think, to have. But it's a small feature. Oh yeah, you can also do it on enum cases. I forgot about that. I said that. Now, PHP 8.5 extends this attribute system that you can also set attributes on constants. I'm not talking about class constants here, but normal constants. Again, who still uses global constants? Not very many. But for some reason, we had forgotten to add attribute support for that in the PHP when we introduced them. 8.5 now allows you to do this kind of thing. Useful? Yes. Groundbreaking? No. You can't do it in these cases. It only works if you use the const keyword, not if you have multiple constants in the same statement. Or it also doesn't work if you call define, because in this case, you set the attribute on define, but you're not declaring define. So that makes no sense. It doesn't do it. Scandalous, yes, I'm sure. We also add this new element to attributes so that you can now also target a constant. But PHP 8.5 introduces, however, another attribute. This has been merged into the code base, which is the no discard attributes. Basically, this tells the engine that if a function that has its attribute set returns something, and then the function that calls it doesn't look at the return value. And in that case, you'll get a warning. So basically, it tells you that if you call a function with this, it must return something. So as an example, it was mostly introduced for userland, but there's a few situations in PHP where you also call a function and you need to do something with the result, otherwise nothing happens, right? If you have the original date class, if you call setDate on it, then it modifies the object, so that's fine. But if you use date time immutable, it returns the new object. So if you don't do anything with the result here, you basically throw that modification away. Because we internally now added this no discard attribute, you now will get a warning for this. Yeah. And of course, you can do this in your own code base as well. For the things where it is important that the result something, either it's important that you do something with it, or it's important that if you have code like this, to make sure that you're not inadvertently doing something or not do something that you're supposed to do, kind of things. I think it's a little small feature to add to the language. Right. You can discard the discard attribute by using a void cast. If you really want to ignore this, why you would want to do this, I don't know. Hopefully at some point our compiler gets clever enough to just remove this whole call to set data because it has no side effects. So you can't use discard when the function is typed with a void or never return types, because it makes no sense. For magic methods, including the constructor that require voids, there's also the wake up and sleep and stuff like that, or have no return type at all, you can also not use it there, you get an error. And you can also not use no discard on property hooks because that makes no sense. Right, discard. PHP 8.4 introduces PDO subclasses. And subclasses are basically a way of making sure that, well, if you do PDO or new PDO, the object that you get back is a PDO object because you should do new object, or so new class name, so you have to return an object of that name. Otherwise, it makes no sense. But there are so many different PDO drivers, like the MySQL one, the PostgreSQL one, the whatever, other Firebird, ODBC ones, SQLite. They all have slightly different behavior. They have different methods that work on them. They sometimes have different constants or methods that don't exist, right? And accessing these from a generic object makes not a lot of sense, because calling getWarningCount when you're using PostgreSQL, the driver would then have to check that and then throw an exception itself, where actually this method really shouldn't exist on the PDO object in that case, but that also you can't do because an object is an object, right? So 8.4 introduces subclasses for each of the different PDO drivers. And on these drivers, or on these subclasses, we then have to find the methods that would only work for that driver. Now, we still can't return those when you do new PDO, because that has to return a PDO object. But there's now a new static method or factory method, however you want to call those, called PDO connect. You give that your DSN, your connection string, as you did before, and that then will automatically return a subclass of PDO that implements this, that is of the correct subtype, which is kind of nice to have. And if it returns the wrong one, then you can do something with it if you wish to do that. Yeah. Let's say Arizona. Obviously, this should never happen, but you never know. PDO subclasses are kind of useful. So now we're going to look at some language thing. So we have an emoji, right? It's the shrugging man emoji, I think. What do you think the output of this is? So I'm going to split this emoji into the different characters. What's going to come out of this? Someone should shout out? Yeah? Emoji Baka, yeah? Would you want to explain what Emoji Baka is? Like this. Yeah, that shit. Because PHP internally only knows about bytes. So the only way how it can split up an emoji is in these 12 bytes. Which is not what you want, and you get weird question marks. So of course, everybody knows here that PHP has better functions for this, called multi-byte strings, right? What is going to be the output of this? Anyone want to shout out? It's not quite Mojibaki, but it is not what you would expect. You would expect to get one character out of it, but no, you get 4 out of it. So you get a generic emoji for person shrugging. Then there is one for the color of the skin, which renders as nothing, whether it's masculine or feminine. And then there is a weird combining one that I actually don't remember what it does. But this is still not what you want, right? If you want to iterate over characters, this is not what you want to get out of it. you want to get out of it is a single character. So PHP 8.4 introduces a new function called, you can guess, called grapheme string split. So the grapheme's subset of functions in the language, they are part of the Intel extension, which does all your fancy Unicode things correctly. So please use these instead of MB string. Anyone wants to guess what comes out of this one? Just a single character emoji, right? So this is PHP 8.4. PHP 8.5, oh yeah, it also works for other weird characters. So my browser actually doesn't render this hello correctly because this accent and this accent are actually on the A. So I guess that's a bug in Firefox or the library that it uses. So if you run this, you get the right things out of it. So it knows that the A is a character, and also the A with all the accents on top is also considered a single character. And then the French flag is a single character. I'm not sure why I picked the French flag and not the Italian one, but now there's also a way how to check differences between different versions of strings. So in this case, my name is Derick. It is not Derek with 2 R's, or Dirk, the Dutch way of the name, or any of the 17 variations that I've seen in my life. So the Levenstein function is a way of getting out of there a value that represents the difference, in definition by some algorithm, between those two strings. So if you do that with just the names, it will basically, for each deletion of character or replication or insertion, it will add 1 to the distance. If you want to see a little bit better how that works, you can actually give weights to the deletion, replacements, and insertions, and by nicely using base 10 here, you actually can then figure out what the differences are. So in this case, if I use this with Derick and Dirk, you see that there are no letters inserted. We can see that. There has been 1 replacement, which is the C for the R, and there's been 2 letters removed, which is the D and the R. Kind of useful to have. But what happens if you have 2 flags? There are 2 emojis, right? If you call Levenstein on this, what would you expect the answer to this would be? What would you hope it would say? Just ignoring the person sitting in front there. Well, no, what would you expect? I mean, what changes? It's 1 character that changes, right? But that's not what the answer is. The answer is 2 out of this, because if you look at the bytes, there are 2 bytes that are different. And these bytes represent the letters that spell out the U and the A, so in the P and the A in this case, or P and the S in this case. So if you look at this, the replacements are these 2 bytes that switched. We don't want that. You can guess what comes next. PHP 8.5 introduces a grapheme Levenstein function. I misspelled it. There's an extra H in there. And of course, then the answer is 1, because that's what you want to get out of this. I like languages. All right, some other stuff that you probably won't like. PHP 8.4, we deprecated the implicit nullability. So if you would set a default value as null, then the type for options would be RST options in this case, or null. In PHP 8.4, that will now throw a deprecation warning. It will tell you, sorry, that's a bit too small, implicitly marking parameter options as nullable is deprecated. So how do you fix this? Yes. You add the question mark in front of the type, or you replace it with or null. Now, this in my old PHP 5.3 code, this caused some problem because this is the style that we had adopted everywhere. Also, it is, from what I remember, Symfony's adopted that as their coding standard for describing nullable types, so they had to change their coding standard for that. Sorry, it happens. Now, however, so far this is a deprecation. It doesn't mean that the functionality doesn't work. Deprecations in PHP basically means like in our next major version, we're going to change this functionality or remove it. So this basically heads up for you that at some point when PHP 9 gets released, which is not going to be this year, because we settled on PHP 8.5 by now. Could it be next year? Yeah. Or not? I don't know. I can't say. But it's basically a way of you for knowing that look at this bit of code and you probably should change it. And it's not hard to change this because you just need to ask a question mark. Right. I've spoken about code now, but we also need to talk a little bit about policies. PHP's functionality gets introduced by something we call RFCs, requests for comments, or requests for code, whatever you fancy at a certain time of the day. But that is also the way how we do governance of the project, how we do releases, how we decide what can be an RFC, what our support time frames are and stuff like that. But all the rules for all of these things are only in these RFCs. So if you wanted to look up on how exactly we do release management or how releases are made or what can be in a release or not, that was separated in 4 or 5 different documents, which is a pain in the bum if you need to figure out what is actually the current rule set. So we worked on a little project that would conflate all these RFCs and put them in one document as a first step. And then after that, we sort of rewritten all of these documents to make them useful and readable. And now anytime we want to change any of the policies, the RFC that changes the policy is a pull request to the policy. So it all becomes into one document. It's a lot easier to read than finding information in many different things. Now, one of the policies that we changed about release management is, oh yeah, you can find them here, is the release cycle in PHP. So PHP for a long, long time, we'd have 2 years of normal support, bug fix support, and then 1 year of security fixes. Right? We always had 3 alpha releases, 3 beta releases, and 6 release candidates. So each of these takes 2 weeks. That makes 24 weeks of time when you can't actually add new functionality to PHP, which is more than a third of the year, which is not great. I don't think it's great. We also had some weird languages about no minor features in beta releases and stuff like that. Or we could introduce minor features in bug fix releases, which is things that none of you actually liking. And also we would end support for a version exactly 3 years after it was initially released. So if PHP 8.0 was released on November 17th, 2020, there's a slide, my next slide says so. Then the support would end November 17th, 2023. Which is kind of annoying because it's always a different date. So what we did immediately, in effect, so this covers everything, every PHP release that was already out there. We do 2 years of support and 2 years of security support with some caveats. We do 2 fewer release candidates. Nobody tests the release candidates anyway, so we can save a month of work here, sort of. So we now allow new minor features in beta releases, but no longer in bug fix releases and release candidates. And the support ends at the end of the 4th year. So that means December 31st. In a graph, it looks like this. So we introduced this somewhere in 2024, but at that point, PHP 8.1 was still in normal support, in security support, so we extended that with a year. PHP 8.0 had already come out of support, so that did not get extended. Also, today is not May 4th, but today is May 15th. I wrote a slide on May 4th, the screenshot. So I think this is actually kind of useful. Now, at some point in the future, we might have to make changes to this again due to regulation. Regulation is starting to impact open source projects more and more. And there's, in the EU, there's a Cyber Resilience Act that Roman sort of mentioned up front as well. PHP Foundation is helping to write guidelines around it and hoping to influence politicians. It's not easy to do. But that might stipulate that we might have to do 5 years of security support in some way or in some form. We don't exactly know what those guidelines are going to be, but that is something that can influence, politicians can influence open source now, and there will be more of that as well. All right, slides are going to be up there, or probably are already up there. If you have questions, feel free to email me. I'm terrible answering email, but I will eventually answer them at some point in the next year. I'm not that bad, but slides there. If you have questions, feel free to find me during the conference. I'm happy to answer more questions on PHP or Xdebug or anything else. And I hope you found this interesting, and I would say enjoy the rest of your 2 days.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.